It was the sort of morning Fernley Cross prided itself on. Bright, temperate, and quietly industrious. The hedgerows bordering the cricket green had been trimmed into neat submission. The church bells had already rung their modest welcome to the Sabbath, and the vicar's wife had ironed bunting with military precision. The annual summer fete was less an event than a tradition, and one rarely disturbed by novelty or rain. The air held the faint perfume of cut grass and lemon sponge, mingled with the rustle of folding tables and the clinking of borrowed teacups. Children skipped between stoles with the untroubled certainty of those whose chief decision was jam or treacle. Meanwhile, the older ladies observed proceedings from their collapsible chairs, hats pinned firmly, and suspicions ever sharper than they appeared. Miss Marple, who had traveled from St. Mary Mead for a quiet visit to her old friend Mrs. Hargreaves, sat unobtrusively by the vicarage gate, knitting in hand, eyes ever observing. There was something about the air, too still perhaps, or too staged. But then again, Fernley Cross had always been the sort of place where smiles lingered just a second longer than needed, and secrets clung to fences like summer ivy. It was the yellow umbrella that caught her attention first, not its color precisely, but its incongruity. The day was quite cloudless. No rain had fallen for over a week, and there was no breeze to speak of. And yet, positioned neatly over a modest trestle table near the west edge of the green, the umbrella opened wide, casting an elongated shadow like the dial of some forgotten sundial. Miss Marple paused in her knitting and tilted her head slightly. It was not that shade itself was unwelcome, but rather that the umbrella's precise placement and deliberate opening felt less accidental than performative. The other stalls, selling lavender soap, hand-stitched tea cozies, and jars of pickled onions, made do without such coverings. Only this one stood out, both in hue and in attitude. She noted how villages instinctively skirted its periphery, approaching with polite interest but not lingering. There was an unspoken reserve, the kind one finds in small communities when something doesn't sit quite right, but is too minor to discuss aloud. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes just slightly, then resumed her knitting. The umbrella would wait. They always did. The stall belonged to Miss Cordelia Blake, a woman not long settled in Fernley Cross. Her arrival had been accompanied by little in the way of scandal, only that she had taken the lease on Briar Cottage, paid a month in advance, and wore gloves even in the post office. She was thought by some to be a widow, though no one could quite recall having seen mourning weeds. Others supposed she was the daughter of a minor baronet, down on her luck, but up on her manners. Today she had arranged her table with care. Rows of neat preserves, gooseberry, blackcurrant, and the ever-controversial rhubarb lined the gingham cloth like obedient soldiers. Each jar bore a handwritten label, its script fine and even. Cordelia herself wore a soft linen dress in a shade not quite mauve, and her smile was both serene and oddly detached, as though she had spent too long perfecting it in private. Miss Marple took note of how she stood, one hand resting gently on a wicker basket, the other lightly touching her scarf, as if adjusting it for an unseen photographer. People said she was lovely, in that faded postcard sort of way. And yet, Jane Marple thought, it was not beauty that made Cordelia Blake memorable. It was something else, something veiled. The scream, when it came, was not loud. It was sharp, brief, and silenced almost as soon as it had begun. It came from Mrs. Lindell, a woman known for her high standards and low sugar tolerance, who had approached Cordelia's stall, intending to taste a spoonful of quince. What she found instead was Cordelia herself, seated upright, eyes closed, her head tilted as if lost in a pleasant memory. For a moment the villagers did not understand. It was too incongruous, too still. Miss Blake did not slump. She did not fall. She merely sat there, her scarf wrapped neatly, her lips parted slightly in what might have been a smile. It was only when the vicar's wife reached forward, intending to steady her shoulder, that the chill of her skin and the stillness of her breath announced what no one had dared name. Cordelia Blake was dead. Chaos, of the quiet kind, ensued. The jam jars were gently cleared away, the children redirected to the tombola, and Dr. Bellamy fetched with as much discretion as could be managed. Miss Marple did not rise. She only pressed a finger to her lips and looked, quite deliberately, at the yellow umbrella above. By early afternoon, Dr. Bellamy had completed his cursory inspection, and the village constable had arrived with a notebook, far too small for the enormity of the occasion. Heart failure was whispered with a certain comfort. After all, Miss Blake had seemed pale of late, and the heat was not to be taken lightly. No marks, no signs of struggle, no scene of violence. Just a death, quiet and inexplicable, on a summer's morning. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. Cordelia Blake had not seemed faint or ill in the least. Her complexion, though fair, was not wan. Her manner, though reserved, had not been diminished. And then there was the expression. Serene, yes, but too arranged, too symmetrical. She sat once more beside Mrs. Hargreaves, who was already recounting the events in whispers shaded with opinion. Miss Marple listened politely, fingers paused in their knitting, eyes still occasionally drawn to the umbrella, open still, its yellow fabric ruffled only slightly at the edges. A woman like Cordelia Blake, she murmured, would not exit the world quite so peacefully, not without a reason, and certainly not without a plan. It was not until early evening, when most of the fête's decorations had been boxed away and the bunting quietly folded, that Miss Marple took her discreet walk across the green. The constable had long since taken his statements and departed for the station. The stall lay bare, its trestle table removed, but the umbrella still stood, its handle loosely tied to the metal base, its shade casting one last shadow across the trampled grass. Miss Marple, unnoticed and unhurried, stepped beneath the canopy and tilted her head upward. There, upon the underside of the central pole, just where the metal met the wood, was a faint dark stain, rust brown, small, and misshapen. It might have been sap, it might have been jam, but it was not. She reached into her handbag for a clean linen handkerchief and dabbed lightly. The color clung. Not sap, not fruit, blood. She stepped back, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Someone had arranged this umbrella not for shade, but for secrecy. Not to protect, but to hide. It had been placed here with care, opened on a day when no one else needed one. Its purpose not weather-related, but theatrical, a performance, a concealment, a stage. And behind it, she suspected, an actor whose final role had been played not in reverence, but in revenge. Inspector Cray arrived the following morning, brisk of manner and professionally unruffled, yet possessing an air of one who had dealt chiefly with urban disruptions rather than village entanglements. His uniform was immaculate, his mustache precise, and his questions carefully arranged to appear less intrusive than they truly were. But Fernley Cross, with its lace curtains and polished manners, did not take kindly to outsiders. even those wearing official boots. The inspector's inquiries began with the practical. Who had seen Cordelia last? Had she shown any signs of malaise? Was there any known enemy, however slight? But the answers came wrapped in hedged phrases and delicate silences. It was not evasion. Fernley Cross did not stoop to evasion. It was simply the natural reticence of those who knew that truth, in villages, was never the same as fact. Miss Marple watched him kindly, though with the faint amusement of one who had long understood that rural life did not yield its secrets to forms in triplicate. The inspector, in his way, meant well. But Fernley Cross was not a place of shouted quarrels or sudden violence. It was a place of quiet omissions, of eyes that turned too soon, and gestures that meant more than words ever could. By noon, Inspector Cray had noted the death as unusual, the circumstances as inconclusive, and the umbrella, now furled, as probably irrelevant. Miss Marple, hearing this from Mrs. Hargreaves, smiled without comment and went back to her knitting. The conversation began, as most village conversations do, with tea. Mrs. Cranley served hers with lavender biscuits, and a particularly pointed recollection of Cordelia Blake's fondness for walking late, even when there was no moon. Mrs. Cundall counted this with warm praise for Miss Blake's contributions to the church flower rota. She never missed a turn, she declared, though admitted she had never seen her actually inside the church. Miss Marple moved gently from parlor to parlor, her presence unassuming, her observations precise. People confided in her not because she asked, but because she did not. One woman recalled Cordelia's fondness for opera records, Verdi mostly, which I found surprising. Another mentioned that she never received letters yet went regularly to the post office. There was a subtle unease in their recollections, as if Cordelia had never fully settled into the shape they had made for her. She was charming, yes, and unfailingly polite, but there had always been a thin veil around her, something unsaid and unsaying. She had been neither quite widow nor spinster, neither visitor nor resident. Miss Marple listened with a serene smile and a slight downward tilt of the eyes. It was not what the villagers remembered that interested her. It was what they collectively forgot to mention. Later that week, a gentleman of solemn bearing and London manners arrived at Briar Cottage bearing a worn leather briefcase and the scent of city dust. He introduced himself as Mr. Bernard Langford, solicitor to the late Lionel Roscoe. The villagers had little use for theatrical men, but they remembered Lionel Roscoe vaguely as an actor who had once bought a house nearby and then sold it in scandal. The fact that he had left anything worth inheriting came as a mild surprise. Mr. Langford was efficient, unhurried, and careful in the arrangement of his words. He confirmed that Cordelia Blake had recently come into possession of a small but respectable sum left by Mr. Roscoe, who, according to probate records, had named her as Miss Anastasia Vane, sometimes known as Cordelia Blake. The phrasing, legal though it was, struck a peculiar chord. Miss Marple's knitting paused. There was also, Mr. Langford added with professional distance, a matter of personal letters and effects which Cordelia had declined to receive in London, and had asked to be sent instead to Fernley Cross. She had, it seemed, expected the inheritance, but had wanted it quietly, without fuss or return. The villagers, of course, knew none of this, but Miss Marple made mental note of the name Anastasia and stored it in the part of her mind where delicate knots were teased into quiet unravelings. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Hargreaves's invitation to help sort through Cordelia's modest effects. Among a series of carefully arranged boxes, lace gloves, handwritten recipes, and precisely wound bowls of string, she found a leather-bound ledger marked "Preserves, 1929 onwards." Tucked between entries for quince jelly and damson chutney, written in Cordelia's precise hand, was a small penciled note that did not fit. "Look beneath what is bright." There was no accompanying signature, no underlined emphasis, merely those 5 words, wedged between the practicalities of jam-making. Miss Marple considered the line carefully. It was not poetic. It was not sentimental. It was instructional. And as ever with such things, it was precisely not where one would expect it. The following day, as light fell gently across the parlor at Briar Cottage, Miss Marple returned, alone this time, with the blessing of the constable and the soft encouragement of Mrs. Hargreaves. The cottage was quiet, though not entirely devoid of presence. Cordelia's careful habits remained in the positioning of cushions, the symmetry of curtains, the scent of rosewater still clinging faintly to the drawers. In the back corner of the parlor stood a narrow wooden cupboard, painted white and faintly warped with age. Inside were the usual things: tea tins, candle stubs, a length of faded bunting. But as Miss Marple tapped lightly along its frame, her fingers found a hollow space, and behind a loose panel, folded as if meant to be forgotten, lay a single theater program, torn along one edge, browned with age. It bore the date, April 1927, and in the list of cast members, one name had been lightly circled in blue pencil: Anastasia Vane. Miss Marple held the paper delicately. Theater names were often chosen for their softness, their beauty, or their rhythm. Anastasia Vane had all 3, but it also had something else, a kind of tragic cadence, like a final note held too long. And now, that name had returned. The name did not strike Miss Marple as unfamiliar. It had been many years, of course, and she did not read theatrical columns often, but the recollection emerged slowly, like a pressed flower found between the pages of an old book. Anastasia Vane had been a minor figure of moderate acclaim in London's quieter theaters. She had possessed, by some accounts, an extraordinary face, more tragic than beautiful, and had fallen from favor following an affair with a married producer, whose name now escaped everyone. But the scandal itself. The affair had ended poorly. The producer returned to his wife. Anastasia vanished. No obituary had followed, only whispers. Miss Marple sat for some time, her thoughts slow and firm. Cordelia Blake had lived like a woman crafting herself into someone else. Gloves in every season, a false calm, a deliberate stillness. If Cordelia Blake had once been Anastasia Vane, then perhaps she had not simply come to Fernley Cross to begin again. Perhaps she had come because something, or someone, had ended. And in the distance, unspoken but rising, came the distinct sense that someone else remembered her too. There are names that linger in memory not because of what they achieved, but because of how they disappeared. Such was Anastasia Vane, a name that once fluttered across theater columns like confetti, only to vanish as suddenly as it had come. Miss Marple remembered her not with admiration, but with that quiet interest reserved for the nearly famous, the nearly ruined, and the thoroughly forgotten. Anastasia had been a striking figure, not quite beautiful, but unmistakably captivating, with a presence more felt than seen. Her performances had favored the tragic heroines, Ophelia, Hedda Gabler, and the like. But it was not her acting that made the papers. It was her association with Franklin Bellamy, a well-regarded producer with a wife he had no intention of leaving. Their affair was whispered of in drawing rooms and printed between the lines of society columns. When Bellamy returned to domestic respectability, Anastasia vanished, not in disgrace, precisely, but in silence. No curtain call, no farewell performance, not even a confirmed sighting at the stage door. One day she was in the papers, the next she was gone. Miss Marple recalled the unease that followed. People do not simply vanish. They retreat, reinvent, or are removed. And when a woman vanishes at the height of murmured scandal, it is seldom the scandal itself that swallows her. It is what she knows, and whom she may one day name. Mrs. Hargreaves, though not given to flights of fancy, had a memory that leaned gently toward poetic phrasing. Over tea and seed cake she recollected an afternoon, not 6 months past, when Cordelia Blake, seated in the parlor after evensong, had remarked upon the garden roses with a wistful smile, and said, "I once played a duchess with roses in her hair, in another life." At the time, Mrs. Hargreaves had thought little of it. Many women, particularly those who lived alone, allowed themselves small fictions, imagined pasts, theatrical reminiscences, the harmless embroidery of quieter days. But now, with the theater program in Miss Marple's possession, and the name Anastasia Vane haunting her thoughts, the remark acquired a peculiar weight. Cordelia had always been composed, almost studiously so. Her words were measured, her laughter quiet, her history politely closed to inquiry. And yet, there had been moments, fleeting but real, when she had glanced a little too long at the photographs on the vicarage mantel, or paused too deliberately before the parish notice board listing concert dates. Miss Marple noted the pattern not by what Cordelia had said, but by what she had carefully avoided. She spoke of London, but never of anyone in it. She liked theater music, but never named a favorite play. She wore no wedding ring, and yet once declined an invitation to a harvest supper for reasons best left unspoken. It was not reticence, it was concealment. Mr. Elwood, the Fête Committee treasurer, and a man of habitual precision, had been cordial in the days following Cordelia's death. But of late, a noticeable shift had come over him. His attention seemed fractured, his voice less sure. When asked by the constable whether he had known Miss Blake well, he had answered too quickly, "Only by sight, of course," and then corrected himself with, "Well, yes, we all knew her, in a manner of speaking." Miss Marple, who had observed him carefully during the last committee meeting, noted that he had fumbled with his papers, miscounted the scone vouchers, and dropped his fountain pen twice. For a man whose accounts were as crisp as his cuffs, such lapses spoke louder than confessions. There was something behind his eyes, a tension not born of grief or shock, but of recognition reluctantly held. He watched the vicar's wife with exaggerated politeness, deferred to the constable with over-rehearsed respect, and spoke of Cordelia Blake with the caution of one recalling not a neighbor, but a ghost. Miss Marple had seen that look before, in widowers who had remarried too soon, in parishioners who had once altered a will for convenience, and in gardeners who had buried more than bulbs. It was not guilt, not yet, but it was memory, and memory once awakened, seldom slept again. With the revelation of Lionel Roscoe's posthumous generosity, the village air began to thicken with speculation. It was not the sum of the inheritance that provoked such interest. though any windfall was news in Fernley Cross. But the why of it? Why would a stage actor long removed from public view leave anything at all to a solitary woman in a borrowed cottage? Mrs. Patterby, who had once seen Roscoe on stage in a touring production of Charlie's Aunt, recalled that he had a rather theatrical fondness for impressionable women. Mrs. Linden countered that she had heard Roscoe was nearly destitute at the end, and that any bequest would have been arranged through persuasion of the most improper kind. In this climate of soft accusation and rolling speculation, the idea of a rewritten will began to take root. It was said, never by anyone specific, that Lionel Roscoe's first will had named a niece in Worthing. Now, suddenly, it had named Cordelia Blake. How very convenient. And what solicitor had drafted it? A London one, no less. Not even a local man. That, to some, said everything. Miss Marple, listening as always, found the rumors tiresome in detail but useful in tone. Fernley Cross did not accuse without purpose. It whispered when it feared it had overlooked something. And in this case it feared Cordelia had not been who she appeared to be, and that someone among them had known it all along. The note arrived 2 days later, pressed into the narrow crevice beside the vicarage kitchen door, folded once and marked in an unfamiliar hand. Mrs. Hargreaves, assuming it a belated thank you from one of the fête stallholders, tossed it to Miss Marple with no great ceremony. But as Miss Marple unfolded the thin paper, a chill passed through her hands. The handwriting was upright, plain, and firm. There were no greetings, no signature, no embellishments. Only a single sentence, written without flourish. She wasn't who you think, and someone still wants her silenced. The absence of threat was more unsettling than its presence. The line was not accusatory, but declarative, as though the matter were already closed and merely waiting for Miss Marple to reach its conclusion. She read the message twice, then tucked it carefully beneath the brass paperweight, shaped like a rose. A gift from Colonel Denning, years ago, after the matter of the missing cameo brooch. It struck her that the phrasing, "still wants her silenced," carried with it the unmistakable weight of unfinished business. Not revenge, but preservation. Not malice, but dread. And that, she thought quietly, is far more dangerous. The note had not been delivered through post, nor handed in with timidity. It had been placed with purpose, by someone who knew the household's rhythms and preferred their warning be received without spectacle. Which, Miss Marple concluded, could only mean one thing. The person who had placed the note had not left Fernley Cross. They were still there, still watching. Briar Cottage, once faintly scented with rosewater and varnished wood, had settled into the peculiar stillness that follows a sudden departure. It was not entirely lifeless. There were still dried lavender bunches in the hallway, and a lace-edged doily upon the escritoire bore a shallow indent where a vase had long stood. But the air no longer moved with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Instead, it hung in corners, as though waiting for something to be named. Miss Marple entered not as an intruder, but as a woman accustomed to absence. Death had never frightened her, only the silences that remained once the living had left. With the permission of Inspector Cray, and the gentle encouragement of Mrs. Hargreaves, she undertook a solitary review of Cordelia Blake's home, trusting not to find answers, but clues. And in Miss Marple's experience, the distinction mattered very much. She moved without hurry, touching nothing unnecessarily, glancing not only at what was displayed, but at what was concealed. Cordelia had lived tidily, perhaps too much so. Nothing was out of place, but everything seemed curated, as though designed to mislead a casual eye. There was, Miss Marple reflected, a certain kind of woman who tidied her house not for comfort, but for legacy. Cordelia Blake had lived alone, but she had lived as if someone might one day search through her things. And now, someone was. It was in the back bedroom, seldom used, cold to the step and dim in character, that Miss Marple found it. The furniture here was older than in the rest of the house, inherited rather than chosen, and the air retained the faint, musty note of long-drawn curtains and quiet regrets. Behind a chest of drawers partially shielded by a faded chintz cloth and long strands of forgotten cobwebs, stood a canvas, large, upright, and not quite abandoned. Miss Marple removed the cloth gently. What emerged was a portrait, striking in its composition, yet soft in execution. A young woman sat beneath a yellow parasol. The sunlight filtered just so, catching her cheekbone in the edge of a knowing smile. Her dress was of an earlier fashion, perhaps the late 1920s, and her expression was not one of contentment, but quiet defiance. There was artistry in the strokes, yes, but also familiarity. This was not a professional commission. This was a painting born of personal longing. The parasol stood out in particular, bright, rounded, and angled in a way that gave it symbolic presence, rather than mere scenic value. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but with memory. The yellow parasol, a deliberate choice in paint, and perhaps in life. There were, she mused, some things that returned again and again, even when one tried to forget. In the lower corner of the canvas, half obscured by a swirl of green that mimicked trailing ivy, lay a signature, E.D. Elwood. The letters were modest, unadorned, and written with the care of someone unsure if their name would ever matter. Miss Marple stood quietly for some time, absorbing the connection not with surprise but with the careful assembling of puzzle pieces, long dispersed. Edmund Daniel Elwood, the Fete treasurer, had been mentioned before in passing, a widower, reclusive, inclined to paint watercolors of local hedgerows, and notably hesitant when Cordelia's name was brought up. This, however, was not a hedgerow, nor was it anonymous. This was a portrait, a study, and not one from memory. The face in the painting was unmistakably Cordelia's, or rather, Anastasia's. There were younger lines, fuller cheeks, the energy of possibility still present in the tilt of the chin. But it was her. Miss Marple considered the implications with the delicacy of one folding fine linen. If Elwood had painted her, it meant he had known her then, before the name change, before Fernley Cross, and if he had known her then, he had certainly recognized her now. Recognition, however, is not always greeted with joy. Sometimes it is received as a threat, and sometimes it becomes motive. Drawn now by a quiet sense of inevitability, Miss Marple turned from the portrait and examined the surrounding room. There were few personal effects here, but in the old wardrobe, among a line of barely worn cardigans and a moth-eaten velvet cloak, she found it. A yellow parasol, neatly closed, its fabric slightly dulled with age. She took it out gently and laid it across the bed. Its design was near identical to the one in the portrait, down to the shape of the handle and the peculiar gold threading that traced the ribs. But here in the real object was a detail not visible in paint, a small brass plate fixed just above the grip, bearing an engraving that had been worn by time but not erased. The initials, A.V. Miss Marple, allowed herself no more than a breath of confirmation. The parasol had belonged to Anastasia Vane, It had traveled with her from a life lived in footlights and borrowed gowns to this small village with its orderly hedges and perfumed church pews. It had not been used recently, and yet, on the day of the fete, a yellow umbrella had been opened. It was not this parasol, and yet it echoed it too well to be coincidence. Miss Marple's mind, ever quiet in its deductions, aligned the images like slides in a lantern: portrait, parasol, painting, death. Some things are not buried, they are folded away, waiting to be unfolded by the wrong or right hands. She examined the parasol again, this time more closely, tracing the grip with practiced fingers than the shaft, which felt strangely heavier than its dainty structure should have allowed. The weight was not balanced. There was density in the base that had no reason to be there, and the handle, when twisted ever so slightly to the left, gave a faint resistance, then yielded. A click. Within the hollow stem, concealed with exquisite precision, lay a thin, stiletto-like blade, no longer than a hairbrush, but wickedly pointed, its steel dulled with age but not with time. A weapon, not for war or protection, but for one single, intimate purpose. Miss Marple did not recoil. Her expression remained still, almost reverent, as she eased the blade back into place and twisted the handle closed once more. The parasol was not a relic. It was a relic turned trap, a sentimental object imbued with personal history, repurposed for concealment and, it seemed, for murder. What had once shaded Anastasia Vane had now returned in another form, used perhaps in the final performance of a life she had tried so hard to erase. And someone, it seemed, had remembered both her and the parasol very well indeed. The trouble began, as trouble so often does in villages, with something innocuous: rhubarb jam. Mrs. Longstreet, who prided herself on an iron digestion and an unshakable constitution, had taken to her bed with stomach cramps and a curious pallor less than 24 hours after the fete. Naturally, her neighbor, who had witnessed her sample Cordelia Blake's preserves with gusto, made the connection swiftly and with whispered conviction. Within days, the suggestion of poison jam had traveled from the greengrocer's counter to the vestry, and from the vestry to the post office queue, growing in implication with every retelling. The jars had been removed by the constable for examination, and the phrase, deliberately laced, was murmured over teacups with the kind of relish usually reserved for scandal. It was said, though never verified, that the jam had a peculiar aftertaste, that Cordelia had refused to eat any herself, that her labels had been recently rewritten as though concealing something. The logic was self-sustaining. She had died mysteriously. Another had fallen ill. The link to village minds was plain. Miss Marple listened to it all with quiet attentiveness. She did not argue, nor did she endorse, but in her expression was a certain reserve, a poised disbelief that stopped just short of dismissal. Poison was dramatic, certainly, but drama, she thought, had never quite been Cordelia's style. Among those who knew Cordelia, or thought they did, Miss Marple stood apart, not because she claimed deeper acquaintance, but because she had studied her with the detached compassion of one who understood women who lived lives in shadow. Cordelia Blake had not been flamboyant. She had been deliberate, every gesture modest, every word calculated with care. To poison jam, especially rhubarb, that most mundane and divisive of preserves, would have required risk, clumsiness, and a complete relinquishment of control. It would have been reckless, visible, vulnerable. No, Miss Marple concluded, if Cordelia had intended harm, she would have done so cleanly, without trace, and in a manner far more subtle than digestive discomfort. Furthermore, Cordelia had tasted none of the jaws herself, but nor had she avoided them. The illness of Mrs. Longstreet, though distressing, could easily have been coincidence or the result of her own overindulgence. After all, the woman had been observed eating 3 sausage rolls and a scone before ever approaching the jam stall. More importantly, Miss Marple knew the difference between theater and truth. The suggestion of poison was too theatrical, too inviting of speculation. It distracted from the real questions of motive, of memory, of the past reasserting itself beneath the yellow canopy. Poison was a red herring, and red herrings, she had found, often served to protect someone very much alive. As the rumor of poisoned preserves faded into the polite background noise of village discourse, attention shifted, quietly but with increasing focus, to Mr. Forsyth, the gardener at Rose Hall. A man of taciturn habits and calloused hands, he had served the estate for nearly a decade with neither praise nor complaint. But it was discovered, by means no one fully explained, that Forsyth had previously worked at Lionel Roscoe's residence in Berkshire, and that his service there had ended abruptly, without reference or farewell. This detail, once unearthed, took root swiftly. Why had Cordelia, once Anastasia, come to Fernley Cross where Forsyth now worked? Was it chance? Or had she followed him, intending something? And why, upon her arrival, had she chosen to remain so near the very man who had once been dismissed from the household of the man who had named her in his will? Miss Marple, who had observed Forsyth carefully since the fete, noted not guilt, but wariness in his bearing. He was a man who kept his eyes to the ground and his speech to a minimum, not, she thought, from fear of exposure, but from long-standing habit. There were men who buried things, and men who knew too well where others had buried theirs. The past, once disturbed, rarely settled quietly, and Forsyth's past, it seemed, had been disturbed not by Cordelia's death, but by her very presence. It was during an unsought conversation in the rectory garden that Mr. Forsyth, in a tone without apology or embellishment, admitted what Miss Marple had already suspected. Yes, he had known who Cordelia truly was. Yes, he had served Lionel Roscoe. Yes, her arrival in Fernley Cross had unsettled him, not because he feared her, but because he feared what she might expose. Forsyth did not say much, but what he did say carried weight. Cordelia, Anastasia, had threatened to put matters right, to bring a certain truth into daylight. She had not named the person involved, but she had said with cool certainty that she had kept what needed keeping, and that the time had come to use it. Forsyth, with the bluntness of a man who trusted deeds more than words, declared that he was not the target of her resolve. He had kept her secret years ago, when others had not. He had been dismissed from Roscoe's service not for wrongdoing, but for overhearing what should never have been spoken. Miss Marple listened without interruption. A man who had been punished for silence was unlikely to betray it easily. But Forsyth had said enough. Whatever Cordelia had come to Fernley Cross to do, it had not been random. She had come with intent, and someone, perhaps the very person she had planned to unmask, had acted first. Returning to the particulars of the fete, Miss Marple requested a copy of the judging schedule. It was a simple document, handwritten, with stoles marked by number and position. But it was in such details that truth, like silver polish, revealed what lay beneath. Cordelia's stall, number 7, had not been chosen by her, but assigned by the committee. More curiously, the yellow umbrella had been part of that assignment. "Shade provided," read the small note beside the name. Miss Marple paused. Cordelia had not brought the umbrella. It had been provided by someone with access to the fête's arrangements and a knowledge of where she would stand. That placement had not been arbitrary. It had been calculated. The umbrella had not merely been decorative. It had been part of a stage, a scene composed with care, and someone on the committee had held the brush. Miss Marple turned her attention to the fête committee itself, a small group, 5 in total, trusted by the parish, responsible for the allocation of stalls and supplies. Mr. Elwood, as treasurer, had handled the budget. Mrs. Delancey had assigned the physical placements. The others had managed logistics, refreshments, and entries. Only one among them, however, had both access to the committee decisions and a pariah, concealed link to Anastasia Vane. Mr. Elwood. He had not merely recognized Cordelia. He had known her, painted her, loved her, perhaps, and when she reappeared carrying with her the threat of the past, he had arranged, discreetly, efficiently, for the yellow umbrella to be placed precisely where she would stand. The placement had not been a convenience. It had been a strategy, a shield for an act that required cover, a frame for a portrait that would never be painted. Miss Marple's thoughts, now orderly and clear, moved towards their natural conclusion. The picture was forming, line by line, shadow by shadow. But one final brushstroke remained before the whole was revealed. There are certain matters best concluded not in drawing rooms nor police stations, but in places where the echoes of past decisions still linger in the air. And so Miss Marple, with the quiet authority that came not from title but from experience, arranged for a final gathering to be held at Rose Hall, the very estate from which so many threads of the mystery seemed to have unraveled. The invitations were not dramatic, nor were they formally addressed. A word through the vicar's wife ear. A note slipped through the parlor door there. Each recipient understood in their own way that attendance was not a request, but a necessity, not because the law demanded it, but because conscience or curiosity did. Mr. Elwood accepted his summons with the stiff resignation of a man who sensed the balance of secrecy shifting against him. Mr. Forsyth arrived without preamble, mud still clinging to the edge of his boots. Inspector Cray, who had learned by now to allow Miss Marple her methods, entered with his notebook discreetly tucked into his pocket. The London solicitor, Mr. Langford, appeared precisely on time, his manner both courteous and grave. A few ladies of the village were also present, ostensibly for the sake of propriety, but truly for the reason all such gatherings endure, to see the truth at last, stripped of rumor. Miss Marple, having stitched together every fiber of this tangled affair, took her place, not at the head of the room, but slightly apart. One does not need to stand at the center to direct the final scene. The drawing room at Rose Hall had once hosted dances and charity raffles. Now it held silence with equal grace. Each guest sat as though positioned by invisible threads. Elwood beside the fireplace, his hands tightly folded. Forsyth near the French windows, arms crossed but eyes unguarded. Inspector Cray standing by the sideboard, alert yet patient, and Mr. Langford with a sheaf of legal documents resting on his lap. Mrs. Hargreaves and Mrs. Delancey sat close together, a shared shawl across their knees, whispering only when it seemed the silence grew too full. No one drank from the teacups provided. No one moved unnecessarily. Miss Marple rose with the quiet steadiness of one who has never been hurried and never needed to be. Her gaze moved gently from one face to another, not in accusation, but in invitation. She was not there to punish, but to explain. There was a moment, brief but perceptible, when the atmosphere shifted, as if all those present had at last accepted that the truth would be revealed. It was not dread that filled the room, but the tired relief of inevitability. Then she began, not with conjecture nor suspicion, but with clarity. Miss Marple began with the simple truth most had suspected, but few had dared confirm. Cordelia Blake had not always been Cordelia Blake. Before the preserves and polite smiles, before the fete and the yellow umbrella, she had been Anastasia Vane, a name once spoken in the same breath as scandal, charm, and disappearance. Years ago, Anastasia had been a woman of considerable talent and dangerous associations. When her affair with Franklin Bellamy collapsed, so too did her career, her prospects, and her name. She vanished not from malice, but from necessity, fleeing shame perhaps, or something even more dangerous. Lionel Roscoe had known her then. Perhaps he had loved her, perhaps only admired her from afar. But when he died, he'd left to her a small inheritance, perhaps as compensation for what the world had taken. It was this bequest, quiet and precise, that brought her back into the world's notice, and ultimately to Fernley Cross. She had come not only for solitude, but for settlement, for closure. She had kept a past carefully guarded, yet not forgotten, and someone had remembered. Miss Marple paused here, letting the room absorb what was already known in silence, and yet carried new weight when spoken aloud. It was not Cordelia who had been dangerous. It was what she had known, and whom she had known it about. It was then that Miss Marple turned to Mr. Elwood, not accusingly but steadily. She spoke of the painting, carefully hidden in Cordelia's back room, of the parasol that appeared in both art and life. She spoke of how the brushstrokes bore not only artistic memory, but emotional imprint, and how that imprint had not faded. Elwood's face remained fixed, but his hands betrayed him, gripping the arms of his chair as if to hold something inside. Miss Marple described the connection, how he had once painted Anastasia, not as a commission, but as devotion, how he had perhaps cherished her in silence, and how, when she vanished, he had buried that affection beneath routine and figures. But love, unspoken and unresolved, does not remain dormant forever. When Cordelia arrived in Fernley Cross, he had recognized her. Not immediately, perhaps, but soon enough. And with that recognition came fear, not only of being exposed, but of reliving the loss. For Elwood, the return of Anastasia Vane was not merely a memory resurrected. It was a scandal revived, a disgrace rekindled. And in his world where reputation was everything, her reappearance was intolerable. Miss Marple let the silence stretch as the weight of unspoken years gathered in the folds of his expression. And so, she continued, the arrangement was made. The fete provided the occasion, the yellow umbrella, the placement of the stall, even the assignment itself, all orchestrated with a precision born of obsession. The umbrella had not been Cordelia's, but Elwood's, a relic perhaps, or a deliberate echo of the one he had once painted. It had been placed not to offer shade, but to obscure intent. Beneath its cover, the dagger within the parasol, the very parasol from that painted memory, had been used. A swift motion, hidden beneath fabric, obscured by the bustle of fete-goers and the angle of the umbrella's shadow. A cut not meant to bleed outward, but inward. A murder committed not in rage but in fearful control. Miss Marple explained how the bloodstain had revealed itself only upon close inspection, and how it aligned precisely with the position Cordelia had been seated. A stage had been set, and Cordelia had played her final role without knowing the script. Elwood hadn't acted from cruelty. That was not his manner. But he had acted from terror, the terror that the past would outlast him, and that the woman he had once painted would now paint him into a corner. Mr. Elwood spoke then, not with protest, but with a voice worn thin by the long labor of hiding. His eyes did not seek sympathy, only understanding. "She was mine. Once," he said, more to the room than to anyone in it. "And then she left the stage and left me." It was not confession, not fully, but it was enough to unlace the knot of mystery and reveal, beneath it, something far sadder than malice. A man undone, not by hatred, but by love, too long silenced, and memory too tightly bound. Miss Marple did not speak again. There was nothing more to say. The portrait remained, but the woman had gone. And so too, now, had the silence that surrounded her. In the days that followed the gathering at Rose Hall, Fernley Cross resumed its rhythm, not precisely as before, but close enough that only the observant might notice the shift. Children still ran from hedgerow to hedgerow, their laughter unspoiled by consequence. The bell at the church continued to ring at the expected hour, and the postman once again took his time over deliveries, pausing for polite conversation where invited. Yet, beneath the returning routine, there was something altered, like a tapestry restitched along a barely visible seam. The fete had ended, the stalls dismantled, the yellow umbrella quietly removed, and by unspoken agreement, never mentioned again. No one, not even the vicar's wife, spoke directly of Elwood. His name was preserved with a kind of respectful omission, filed away with other things too old or too complicated to retell. Mr. Forsyth resumed his tending of Rose Hall's grounds, quieter than before, but not diminished. He worked as though fulfilling a debt to silence. The London solicitor came and went, arranging matters of estate with a thoroughness that revealed nothing more. The jam jars, save for a few unopened and now avoided with discreet firmness, were quietly donated to the Women's Guild. Fernley Cross, in its way, understood the business of moving on, not as forgetting, but as rearranging. It was not a village that held its breath. It merely exhaled slowly and deliberately, as if aware that peace, too, must be tended like a garden, gently, and without haste. It was in Mrs. Hargreaves's back garden, under the lilac that had bloomed late that year, that Miss Marple sat with her tea. The air carried the fading warmth of afternoon, tinged faintly with the scent of marigolds, and the soft rustle of bees, growing lazy in the light. Mrs. Hargreaves poured with habitual grace, though her hands lingered longer than usual on the teapot lid. Neither woman spoke at first, each seemingly content with the companionable quiet that true friendship requires no effort to maintain. When at last Mrs. Hargreaves ventured a remark about the roses, or the tea, or perhaps the vicar's new sermon, it was received with the kind of smile that held more knowledge than amusement. Miss Marple stirred her cup once, then let the spoon rest. There had been too many endings lately, too many performances unmasked and truths disinterred. But here, in the declining sun, there was peace. Not the peace of innocence, but of understanding. Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the border, where the last of the summer flowers clung to color as the light grew softer. She said nothing of Elwood, nothing of Cordelia, nothing of umbrellas or daggers or theater programs, faded with time. But in her silence there was a completeness, the kind that follows only when every thread has been woven back into place. Even the sky, golden at the edges, seemed to concede that this was enough. For now. As the teacups cooled and the garden shadows lengthened, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to drift not backward, but inward, toward that most elusive of conclusions, the understanding of people. It was never the crime itself that preoccupied her, nor the solution, though both were necessary and at times satisfying. It was the heart of the matter, the quiet despair or longing or fear that lingered long after facts were sorted and papers filed. Cordelia Blake had not come to Fernley Cross to deceive, but to be forgotten, to live not as a tragedy, but as a woman who preferred silence to performance. And yet, by stepping again into the public world, even in so small a stage as a village fete, she had reawakened a history others had never laid to rest. Elwood, too, had been a man of roles, quiet treasurer, precise painter, forgotten suitor. His act had not been one of hatred, but of desperate containment, of trying to close a chapter that had been carelessly reopened. And yet, like all poorly written endings, his attempt only magnified what he meant to obscure. Miss Marple understood this well. In her years she had observed many such roles. Husbands who were not protectors, wives who were not meek, vicars who were not virtuous, and children who saw far more than they ought. The world was a stage, yes, but not always a theater. Often it was a parlor, a garden, a fete, and some curtains once drawn left more than shadows behind. It was perhaps the umbrella that remained in her mind, not as evidence, but as symbol, opened on a cloudless day, vivid and unnecessary. It had not shaded from the sun, but from the truth. In that cheerful yellow lay the oldest deception, the belief that if one surrounds the past with enough color, it cannot be seen for what it is. But truth, Miss Marple had long known, does not shrink from brightness. It waits patiently beneath it. As she stood to leave, she remarked almost to herself that the most dangerous secrets are never cloaked in gloom. They smile, they charm, they sit politely behind jam jars and pastel bunting, and sometimes they wait beneath a yellow umbrella, open wide, not to keep something out, but to hide something in plain sight. And with that, the day slipped gently into evening. Thank you for joining us for the Murder Under the Yellow Umbrella. In the quiet lanes of Fernley Cross, where life moves at the pace of the post and secrets tend to grow like ivy on old stone, we watched a mystery unfold, not just of a death, but of a life carefully rewritten. Miss Marple, with her ever-watchful eye and quiet understanding of the human heart, reminded us that truth does not always hide in darkness. Sometimes it sits smiling in plain sight, beneath bunting, among jam jars, or shaded under something as ordinary as a yellow umbrella. Cordelia Blake lived not to deceive, but to disappear. Yet even the most carefully hidden past has a way of resurfacing, especially when love turns possessive and memory grows sharper than steel. Elwood's act was not born from hatred, but from fear, a fear that the return of a name long buried would undo the fragile respectability he'd constructed. In the end, it wasn't the scandal that killed her. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.